All right, good afternoon everybody. It's great to be here. We're here because we stand with Israel. There are some ladies around handing out pamphlets. There's some basic information on the size of Israel and the sort of rockets that Hamas has been firing toward the state of Israel over the last few weeks. In 11 days, 4,400 rockets were fired indiscriminately upon the land of Israel. Thanks to Iron Dome, 90% of those were shot down. However, those that managed to get through the security net still did tremendous damage and killed innocent civilians and maimed and wounded others. Let me just say this. We sympathise with all the innocent civilians on both sides of the conflict. That is with Israeli civilians and with the Palestinian civilians. But let me just make one thing clear here. Israel is not responsible for the carnage in the war. Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, have incited this war, and Israel has the right to defend itself. Let me tell you a few facts. What the problem is that in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighbourhood of East Jerusalem, there were some Arab tenants who were not paying their rent. The landlords were Jewish. They hadn't actually paid their rent for decades. And so the Jewish landlords simply wanted to take them to court to either have them evicted or to come to some form of agreement with them. Everything was working okay through the legal process until the Palestinian Authority saw its opportunity to turn this not into a landlord and tenant dispute, but to turn it into a political campaign, which has now led to a full-fledged war. That is what has happened. So what began as a dispute between a tenant and a landlord and his tenants has turned into this Operation Guardian of the Walls. Hamas warned Israel that if riots which were subsequent to the affair around Sheikh Jarrah, if the riots or the police and security forces did not get off the Temple Mount being an area that is sacred and holy, first to the Jew, because their holy temples were there first, and second to the Muslims, because that's where their mosques are. And Hamas gave an ultimatum to Israel that if they did not remove their security forces from the Temple Mount, who were trying to bring calm and arrest the perpetrators of violent actions by the Palestinian youth on the Temple Mount, they threatened they would begin a barrage of rockets upon the state of Israel. And sure enough, at 6 o'clock on the 10th of May, Hamas kept their word, and hundreds of rockets were poured in over Israel's borders indiscriminately, hurting, maiming, killing and destroying property. That is what started this conflict and this war. The media turned it into an affair where Israel is the bully and the oppressor and the aggressor. That is far from the truth. I'll make it clear again. The aggressor in the latest conflict you've witnessed is Hamas. The defender is Israel. And we're here today to stand with Israel's right to defend itself. Amen. What you see in the news often is a distorted version of the reality on the ground. So we hear that there was something like 230 Palestinians killed in Gaza as a result of the war that Israel was forced to fight to defend its own citizens. Although Hamas is saying that there were 20 of its operatives killed among those 230 fatalities, the facts are the Israelis are telling us that the fatalities among the operatives of Hamas, the terrorists, was more like 130 of them, because Israel was deliberately targeting the leaders of Hamas, those responsible for perpetrating the war, as well as all of the technical support and the buildings involved in the whole infrastructure behind that terrorist organisation. So when you see on the news the whole buildings collapsing, it is true they did collapse, but they were not necessarily residential buildings deliberately targeted by Israel. They were simply buildings that housed the infrastructure of Hamas, the terrorist organisation. Another problem that I have heard, and this is straight from the Israeli ambassador, is that there are over 100 miles of tunnels underground in Gaza. Now, Gaza would be a strip of land that would go roughly from Clifton out here in Hawke's Bay, and it would run all the way around to Whirinaki. It's about 30 or 40 kilometres long and 10 or 15 miles or kilometres wide. And the fact that Hamas had used its billions of dollars that is given for humanitarian aid for Palestinians, they had used it to build terror tunnels from which they could launch rockets against Israel, tells you something about how much the Hamas government care for its own civilians. And what was happening in the latest round is that the Israelis were targeting those underground tunnels to destroy them because they housed the Hamas operatives as well as the rocket launching sites and pads. That's what was happening. Now, when the Israelis targeted those tunnels, they didn't know that those tunnels had deliberately been built underneath residential apartment blocks and houses. And so when those tunnels collapsed because of the force of the explosions, they brought down housing and buildings above the ground that were directly built on top of those tunnels. So Israel was simply defending itself, and Hamas have deliberately used their own people as collateral. They have deliberately put the Palestinian people in Gaza as human shields. That's what they do. You have to know that because often it's not reported in our media. So on one side you have Hamas firing from civilian areas in Gaza. That's a war crime. Firing into civilian population in Israel is a second war crime. And all Israel is doing is to try and knock out those who are doing it. On one side it is aggression, Hamas. On the other side, Israel is simply defending itself. You just have to know those facts.